and welcome back to the workshop. In today's episode, we're going to be doing a deep dive into Damascus steel. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about the material. A lot of people have a very surface level knowledge, whether that's correct information or incorrect information. We're going to find out today. We're going to dive into the history behind it, the way that it's made with modern tools and technology, the way that we finish it, and some of the modern applications and stuff like that. So let's jump right on in. Quick shameless plug, if you guys like forging things and you want to support the company, a great way to do that, check out the hats that we just put up on the website. We got 4 different colors. They're all good, leather patches, super cool. Let's keep on going. Now, the history behind Damascus started basically as soon as steel started being made several thousand years ago. And there's 2 types of material, 2 types of steel that are commonly called Damascus. There's what we call Wootz nowadays, which is a crucible steel that has a pattern due to the dendritic formations in it. And then there's pattern welded steel, which is what most people know as Damascus. That's what we call Damascus. That's what everybody calls Damascus. Now, both of these materials were historically called Damascus. And if you think that that's wrong, you can go watch the video that we made with master bladesmith Steve Schwarzer, who is an absolute expert on the subject, and you can click that link right up here if you want to dive into that. We're not really going to dive into Wootz because that's just a whole other rabbit hole to go down. Super cool stuff, but what we're going to be talking about today is the pattern welded material. The history behind it is that a couple thousand years ago, they didn't have the ability to do 1,000 pounds of steel at a time. That process for mass producing steel started in the mid 1800s during the Industrial Revolution, but before that, steel had to be made in small batches, and so it was kind of inconsistent. You weren't getting the exact same carbon content, which is what differentiates steel from iron, along with a couple other alloying elements. So they had to mix it and fold it, and that is how they ended up with the different patterns. And now, not to toot my own horn, but I'm something of a subject matter expert. I am awfully good at being able to reverse engineer patterns and figure out how things were made. My brain just works like that. And there are many patterns and things that I see historically, and I cannot wrap my head around how these craftsmen were able to create such fine and intricate patterns with such repeatability. It's very impressive. Fast forward a couple hundred years, they used it for swords, and then in like the 14 and 1500s, they were used for gun barrels to start off with, and there's some amazing pattern welding that was done there. And then there's kind of what some people would kind of refer to as maybe like the dark age of Damascus, where people in America kind of thought that it was maybe lost.
Keep searching.
But pattern welded steel actually never stopped being produced. It was still being produced and used in shotgun barrels in Belgium and Germany, and kind of that region. And then sometime in the 1960s, 1970s, a gentleman by the name of Bill Moran, who is the founder of the American Bladesmith Society, rediscovered Damascus. Now, he is credited with that. That's not technically true, but he did definitely bring back the popularity of pattern welded steel. And then since then, it's just been an explosion, especially up through the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And nowadays, people are building crazier patterns than ever. And before we get too far, I should say, if you guys enjoy this type of content, educational, cool B-roll, all that good stuff, go ahead and like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more fun videos like this. It really helps out the channel, helps us be able to continue to do this fun content. So let's dig into how this stuff actually gets made. In order to have a pattern welded steel that you can see the pattern, you need 2 ingredients. You need to have something that will darken with an acid etching process of some sort, and something that will stay bright. So the most common materials that are used are 1080 high carbon steel or 1085, 80 CRV2, some type of steel that is not going to resist the acid. And then the other really common steels are 15N20 or L6. Those both have a high nickel content. You can also use pure nickel. But the problem with pure nickel is it doesn't harden the same way that the high carbon steels that we're using for our knives are, whereas 1080 and 15N20, not only do they move very similar under a power hammer or press, but they also heat treat and temper about the exact same. So you can get a really high performance knife that you can also build a pattern into. So if you don't use 2 steels that have a differing acid resistant alloying element in them, then you don't end up with a high contrast pattern. So if you were to use just 2 different carbon contents of a similar steel, like if you were to use 1075 and 1095, which are very similar steels, except for the carbon content, you would see a little bit of a pattern, but it wouldn't stand out in the same way as when you build a pattern with a high nickel content and then a no nickel content steel like 1080 and 15N20. Now the first combo of steels that were used, as far as I know, was mild steel and O1. O1 is a tool steel. Mild steel does not have any carbon in it. And Bill Moran mixed these two together, and he was able to see a pattern. Because there's enough alloying differences between the two steels that you were able to see a little bit of something, but you weren't getting the black and white high contrast finish people really chase after nowadays. Now that you've got your steel, you know what your material is, you want your two different contrasting materials, you need to be able to stick it together. Now historically, they didn't have welders, and so what was common was to take the two different types of steel, and as far as I understand it, they did it different ways in different parts of the world, either wrapping it in wire or just stacking it on top of itself when you're working with like kind of a bloom of steel. They didn't have the refined bar stock that we start off with nowadays. The Japanese oftentimes would wrap it in hay and clay, and to keep the oxygen out of it to get a good weld and to kind of insulate it a little bit. But thankfully, nowadays, it's really easy to get the steel that we need in a very convenient, very manageable size. You can order your 1/8 inch thick, 1.5 inch wide, 48-inch long bar. You can cut it up into whatever length that you want, and it's very simple and very easy to build a billet, a starting billet. It's going to be very easy to work with. Now, the way that you layer this material affects how the pattern ends up. And so if you think about it, like black and white clay, your black clay is the 1080 steel, your white clay is the 15N20 steel because it resists the acid. And if you were to take black and white clay and slap them together, smush them down a little bit, and they stick. But if you just started off with one piece and stuck it together, it would take a long time to get a pattern that would look good. And so most of the time, we'll start off with multiple pieces of 1080 and multiple pieces of 15N20. Now, a pretty common stack up that most bladesmiths in their home shop, professional bladesmiths, are going to be starting off with is either 1.5 inch wide or 2 inch wide steel and kind of like 6 to 8 inches long, maybe an 1/8 inch thick. And then they can stack this up an 1/8 inch at a time until they get to 5, 6 inches tall. And that means they can start with 20 to 30 layers of steel. And so when they forge that back down, they're able to get a jump start on getting their layers up for building a pattern. Now that's not always the case depending on the pattern that you're building. Sometimes you might want less than that. Sometimes you might find thinner layers and get more than that. We'll talk more about pattern development and how to change the way that the layers look when you're done. Circling back around to, you've got your stack up of 25 layers. How do you get those things stuck together? And so we start off with our billet of steel. We chop it up into the right pieces. And now most of the time we kind of just weld the corners together with a MIG welder. This is a super strong method, and it means that as the steel expands and as you move it around in the forge, those pieces of different material aren't going to fall apart. Obviously, if you take two pieces of steel and you stick them together, nothing's going to happen. You got to do something to it to get those fellers stuck. The way that we do that is by the process of forge welding. This is where we heat up the material and then either press it together or hit it together with a hammer, and those layers stick together. What you're left with is two distinct layers. You can see the black layers, you can see the white layers, but they're stuck together. And then you're able to stretch it, push it, pull it, chop it, bop it, twist it. All that stuff. Most of the time, we're heating the steel up to anywhere between 2,000 and 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit to stick it together. Now, if you were to just take two pieces of steel, lay them on top of each other, throw them in a forge, take it out and try to whack it, it probably wouldn't stick. And the reason for that is that oxygen is able to get in there and it builds up that layer of forge scale. That's this stuff that the whole shop is just covered with around here. That is iron oxide. It's rust, basically, but it happens really fast, and so it's not orange. And so we need to keep the oxygen off of there somehow. The most intense way to do it, this is a process that was developed a long time ago by guys like Steve Schwarzer and Daryl Meyer, was to weld a can all the way around the billet. So you're putting sheet metal on the sides of your 25 layers, and then they'll actually weld a tube into that with a little weep hole on the far side and run argon through it. So argon is an inert gas. It means that that steel is not going to oxidize, and you can get perfect forge welds. There's no oxygen coming in from anywhere, just argon running through it. So you get perfect forge welds that way. That is the most controlled way, the most consistent way to do it. Kind of the next step down, still a very secure way, pretty much guaranteed to get perfect welds, is you can just kind of cover up the edges. You weld a little sheet metal on the sides or something like that. You spray it with a little WD-40 or another hydrocarbon, something that's going to burn up when it gets to temperature, and you'll have a really thin layer of carbon in there. You actually don't even need to do that, but you're just keeping the oxygen off of all of those layers. And then kind of the next step down from that is you just kind of leave the sides open willy-nilly and throw that sucker in the forge and then sprinkle a little bit of flux on it. Flux is a white powder that we use. I'm sure if you guys have seen other bladesmithing videos, you've probably seen people sprinkling that white powder on there. Flux is usually made out of borax. There's all kinds of different flux, but most commonly used is borax. Borax has boratic acid in it, and that melts away iron oxide. But boratic acid, that flux, can actually get in between your layers and can potentially cause some problems. If you hit it in the wrong way, it can get trapped and cause flaws in your forge weld. I don't like to do that very much either. I like to just kind of go for it. We get our pieces together. I like to weld up my corners and then maybe one MIG weld bead along the sides. And then as long as the atmosphere of the propane or natural gas forge that you're using is what we call a reducing flame, where it has more fuel than oxygen. So the fuel actually has to come outside of the forge to combust. That's where we see the big, what we call dragon's breath coming out of the forge. As long as you have a good reducing atmosphere and your billet is welded up tight, so there's not any big gaps in there, you're actually able to get away without any sheet metal, no argon, no flux, and just bring the billet out. And as long as you get it under the hammer fast, where there's not a lot of time for that steel to kind of soak up the oxygen, you're able to get perfectly clean forge welds, no risk of flux getting trapped in there, and it's a lot faster than having to weld sheet metal on the sides, which then you have to grind it off later, and you don't have to deal with running argon through it. And so that is the way that I personally prefer to do high carbon steel forge welding. Now, the things to note is that you just have to make sure that you have a securely welded billet when you do that, and that your machinery is ready to rock and roll when you pull the billet out of the fire. Now, that brings us to the next step. What happens once your material is hot and it's ready to get stuck together with a forge weld? There's a couple different ways that you can do it. You can do it with a hand hammer. Nowadays, very blessed to have some big equipment that we can get these things forge welded on. Now, there's kind of two different main machines that we do this with, either a power hammer, which are super fun, very gnarly machines, they're a great time, or a hydraulic forging press. Now, a hydraulic forging press puts a squish on it, a power hammer hits it. I personally, for doing big billets at Damascus, prefer a power hammer. The reason for that is that it keeps the heat in the material a little bit better. And depending on the size of your hammer, if you have a big enough hammer, you can move the material faster. Now, it's more economical to go with a forging press because you can move bigger pieces of material with a smaller forging press. Say a press from a company like Coal Iron Works, you'll be able to forge, 10, 15-pound billets of Damascus on a 25-ton press. And in order to be able to do billets that big efficiently, you're probably going to need like a 200 or 300-pound hammer, which is a significant investment, way harder to run, way harder to install, way louder. So if you're at a home shop, it's not as viable of an option. But if you want to get it done quickly, a power hammer is the way to go. If you want a versatile machine, most bladesmiths just use a hydraulic forging press. So you've got your two different contrasting steels. They're welded up. They've been forge welded. What happens next? After this happens, say you've got 25 layers of steel, the way that that's going to look, if you were to just forge it down and make a knife out of it, it's realistically not going to look very good. That is a really low layer count, depending on how thin you forge it. I'd say usually what's going to look really good is about 100 layers per 1/8 of an inch of material. The reason that I say that is because if you say that you have a 100-layer billet of steel, a 100-layer billet of steel is going to look a lot different forged down to an 1/8 inch thick than it will at 1 inch thick. At 1 inch thick, 100 layers is going to look super, super bold, kind of like a cow with kind of like bigger splotches and whatnot. It can still totally look good. I'd say most of the time people are looking for maybe a little bit finer of a pattern. You start to get a chatoyant effect where the light plays off of the steel in a really interesting way when you get into the higher layers. If you're doing an 1/8 inch thick knife, 100 to 200 layers is going to look really good. But if your knife is 1/4 of an inch thick, then it's probably going to need to be 200 to 400, maybe even 500 layers. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, how do you get from that 25 layer mark to that 250 layer mark? A couple different ways to do it. The way that most people are familiar with, the way that most people phrase the question to me when they see that I have a Damascus knife in my pocket is they say, oh, how many folds is this?
Have you returned to the fold?
Now, folding is one way to get your layers from 25 to 250. And the way that you would do that, we do it hot. And so what you do is you would hot cut the billet, usually in half, clean it off as best as you can, and fold it around and stick it together. So if you had a 25 layer billet, and if you folded it in half and stuck it back together successfully, congratulations, you've got 50 layers. The problem with this is that it's a lot harder to keep that steel clean, where you're going to get a perfectly clean forge weld when you do the hot folding method. It's still doable, but it's more of a challenge. What is a lot more common, and in my opinion, more efficient, is to forge out your billet to, say, a 1/2 inch thick, 2 inches wide, and you let it cool down. And if your billet is 1/2 inch thick, 2 inches wide, 24 inches long, then what you can do is grind the surface clean. You grind through all of that oxidation, that thick forge scale layer. You get it clean on a belt grinder. Usually we'll bust through the tough scale with an angle grinder and then clean it up on a belt grinder. If you're blessed to have a belt converted surface grinder, that's another very efficient way to get through all that material. And then what you can do, if your billet is 24 inches long, you can cut it into 6-inch long pieces or 4-inch long pieces. And so if you cut it into 6-inch long pieces, you can take that 25 layers, you can stack it up 4 times. That means that you just went from 25 layers to 100 layers. All in one go, with a much higher chance of having clean, successful forge welds. Or if you cut it into 4-inch long pieces, you can take that 25 layers and stack it up 6 times. Congratulations, you're at 150 layers. Good for you.
Yes, I did it. Pretty cool, huh?
Now, the downside of letting a billet cool down and grinding off all that material, you're going to lose a little bit of material on your ends, you're going to lose material that you lose to grinding, is that you're going to lose a little bit more material than you do with the hot folding method. But you have a higher chance of success, and you have the ability to exponentially multiply your layers faster. I and most professional bladesmiths prefer the cool down and restack method, and we'll get into a little bit of pattern development later on, which is another reason why that method is pretty handy. Now, before we get too far into getting our layer count up nice and high, I should mention, if you go too high with the layer count, it just kind of washes out. Think about it back to the clay analogy. If you take your black and white clay and you fold it and fold it and fold it and fold it, what's going to happen? It's going to turn gray. Same thing happens with steel. If the layers get so fine that you can't tell the differentiation between them anymore, it just kind of grays it out. You can't really see the pattern. And so you do kind of want to find the sweet spot between a density that's fine enough that you might want to get a little chatoyance in there, which again is where the light plays off of it. But you can still see the individual layers, and so it's kind of visually interesting. Something that I like to shoot for with my patterns, and I don't do very many patterns where it's just a layered material for my custom stuff, is I like to have something where you see it from a couple feet away and you go, whoa, that looks good. And then you look at it up close and you see another layer of intricacy in the pattern that really draws you in. It's totally doable. It's a lot of fun to shoot for that in a pattern that you design. Now, building layers is just kind of a entry-level way to get into Damascus patterns. But what happens if you were to just do a 150 layer billet and then forge a knife out of it, grind your knife, finish it up, it probably wouldn't look that good. And the reason for that is that all of those layers are still going totally perpendicular to the blade, theoretically. Obviously, you're going to have some hammer marks in there, so it's going to be a little bit randomized, but you need to be able to bring those layers and show off the topography of the steel in a way. And there's 2 different ways to do that in what we call a surface manipulation pattern. You can either forge, press in a pattern to the outside and then grind off the topography, and what happens is you manipulate that straight laminated steel, and then when you grind it down, you show the areas that were ground off. Or you can either grind in a pattern. And so if you were to grind in lines and then forge weld it down, you're again going to bring that pattern up to the surface. This is what we call surface manipulation patterns. There's all different kinds of things that you can do with it. theoretically, anything that you can grind or press into the surface and then grind down, you could draw pictures in the steel. You can do all sorts of different tessellating, nesting patterns. There's ladder pattern, raindrop pattern, there's Texas wind. There's all sorts of different stuff that you can do. Random pattern. This is the easiest kind of pattern to produce on scale, but it's not the most technically complex, and so it's not what most really crazy pattern welders are getting into nowadays. It is a very historical method. There's a lot of random pattern from 1,000 years ago floating around out there. The other really common method of bringing patterns to the surface is through twisting the bar. Now, the way that twisting brings the pattern to the surface is really hard to explain. Essentially, what you're left with is a dynamic pattern that as you grind farther into it, the pattern changes. And so usually you want to shoot to grind in about 30 to 40% in on the sides, and what you're left with is a really neat kind of star-bursting flowing pattern. Now, a really common historic method was to twist multiple bars of steel and then forge weld them together and then grind it down, and what you're left with is a really nice pattern that if you do it properly can line up with itself. It's very visually appealing, and it's a really neat way to not only strengthen the material because you're mixing it so that the forge weld lines are no longer just straight sideways on the material, but they're wrapped around, and so it can kind of really help strengthen that pattern. That's not a big consideration nowadays because our forge welds are so good, but back in the day that could be really helpful for building a sword that needs to hold up to raiding English villages and stuff like that. That was a very common pattern welding method in the Vikings and with the Merovingian Franks and with the Turks. It was pretty common all over the world, but it's, I would say, probably most well known in the Viking style of sword making. So we talked about surface manipulation patterns, we talked about twisting patterns and multi-bar patterns. The final way, which is the most complex way, is to do a mosaic pattern. And that is, rather than manipulating the surface of the pattern or twisting it, you're manipulating the end of the bar of steel. This is my favorite way to design patterns because you can get real wacky with it. There's no end to the patterns that you can do with mosaics. And what you're doing, rather than just building up straight layers, is you can basically build patterns into the end of the bar, and then there's a couple different ways that you can bring out that pattern to the surface. Now, probably the most common method of bringing a mosaic pattern to the surface is to do what we call the tiling method, where you cut slabs off of the end of this bar and you stack them up, and you either cut them at an angle so that they can overlap with kind of a scarf joint and forge weld them together, or you can do a upset weld where you make sure that they can't go anywhere by welding around the edges or something like that. You just forge weld them flat and they expand and forge weld to each other. Also, just build a really big bar, cut a slab off of it, and then just forge it to whatever shape you want. You can also twist it, which is another really interesting way to bring a mosaic pattern to the surface because it stays really dynamic and really flowy. The other way where you don't have to cut off a bunch of pieces is doing what's called an accordion cut, which is where you take a bar and you cut in from both sides. You cut almost all the way through, and then you basically take that bar and stretch it out. And so you're left with another very dynamic, flowy pattern. The problem with this is that you end up with some straight lines connecting the pattern, which I'm not a huge fan of. There are ways to do it without doing that. You can cut V grooves out of it. This is not my favorite way to do it, but it is a way to do it. So each of these different methods, mosaic, twisting, surface manipulation, all have their upsides and downsides. Mosaic pretty much takes the longest, and you're going to have a lot of material loss. You're also going to have a lot of material loss on twisted patterns because you need to grind in so much on the sides to make it look good. Surface manipulation, depending on how you do it, you're also going to have a lot of material loss. There's kind of no winning here. Now, that's one of the reasons why Damascus ends up costing so much, is because you lose so much of the material and it's so time intensive to build it. Now, you've got your knife made. Now, there's two things that you need to do in order to be able to get a good high contrast pattern. The first thing is that you need to harden the material. The material that we're working with are martensitic steels, which means that they are capable of forming martensite, which is the hardened grain structure of steel. It's also what my dog is named after. His name's Marty, but his full name is martensite. And if you don't harden it, if you leave it in one of the other grain structures, perlite or cementite, the steel is not going to etch properly. And we're going to talk about etching here in a second. You need to harden your piece of steel, which if you're building a knife is something that you have to do anyway. It's just another step in the process, kind of driving up the cost of making a Damascus part. It just adds a layer of complexity because every surface after you harden something needs to be re-cleaned up. And so you can't get a part or a knife to the finished. It can't be done and then harden it because you're going to mess up the surface finish of almost anything when you bring it up to 1500 degrees and then quench it in oil or salts. There are a couple ways that you can get around it, but for the most part, you have to refinish or even remove a decent little bit of material after you've done your hardening process. That adds a layer of complexity and a layer of challenge into doing mass production pieces out of Damascus. It's just not super easy. And then after that's done, you need to finish it up very nicely. Usually for me, that means hand sanding it to 600 grit, which means that you need to grind it very finely and then go through the whole hand polishing process. And the reason why we need to finish it so finely is because the etching process doesn't really change the surface all that much, especially in the white bright steel, the 15N20. That steel is going to maintain essentially the same surface finish that you put it into the acid with because that nickel is going to be resisting the acid. It's not going to let itself be changed very much by it. Now, the darker steel, the 1080 or the 1085 or the 1095 ADCRV2, whatever you use is going to hide the surface finish a little bit better. But if you have a mix of the two materials, you don't want it to look junky in the bright steel and then look great in the dark steel because that's still going to look junky. It's going to look bad. And so you need to get a nice, fine, hand-sanded finish before you go through the etching process. Now, there are kind of three different acids that I'd say are really common for etching nowadays. There's ferric chloride. That is the most historical acid that has been being used for a long time. There is instant coffee, which is, you probably shouldn't drink it because it etches steel, and it's usually what most people finish their knives with because you can get really good results where you get really dark steel and really bright steel with an oxide that holds on really good. And then the third option is a new product that came to the market a couple years ago from our friends over at Baker Forge, and it's a product called Gator Piss. And I don't know exactly what's in it, but it does some neat stuff. Now, before you ask, it's not actually made out of alligator urine. Common misconception. It's a chemical mix that they mix, and it works really good. It does a really good job at not tarnishing your 15N20 while still etching some depth into your darker steel. You can get some really good results with having that black oxide hang on to your darker steel as well with it. I personally use all three of these acids in conjunction to get my pieces finished. I usually start off with the ferric chloride because the ferric chloride will very slightly even out the finish of the 15N20. It doesn't really darken it too much, but it kind of blends it a little bit. That's probably the best way to say it. And so you can go back in after it's been blended. I like to use a weaker concentration of ferric. You can either buff it with a little compound on a buffing wheel. You can use a sunshine cloth. I will then degrease it again and go into Gator Piss. This leaves my 15N20 alone perfectly, and if I got a really good surface finish out of the ferric chloride, then I can get a little bit more depth with the Gator Piss while leaving my 15N20 alone. I personally have struggled with keeping that really good dark etch from Gator Piss, and so I will then clean it off. I'll use some like 4000 grit micro mesh, which does almost nothing, but it cleans it up just a little bit. And then I will go into my instant coffee mix for my really black finish. And again, depending on how you mix it and how you treat it afterwards, you can get really, really good contrast, black and white, just popping like crazy if you use that instant coffee. And so once you have a good etch, you got to protect it in some way. If it's a showpiece, an art knife, that's not going to be being used. It's a little bit easier. It's pretty common nowadays to either just oil it or to do some sort of hard wax on there. Usually a carnauba-based wax, that's pretty common nowadays for kind of sealing that oxide on there. But if you got a working knife that's, a kitchen knife going into the kitchen, or a pocket knife that's gonna live in your pocket, you're gonna wear off almost any finish that you put on there. And so eventually, because it's high carbon steel that we're talking about, it will tarnish, it will patina, it's gonna change, you're gonna lose your etch. You can always re-etch it, but it's just kind of a fact of life. If you got like a cool art knife, a dagger, a fighting knife, something like that, then theoretically you can keep that good etch forever, especially if you seal it with a hard, long-lasting wax like that. Renaissance wax is a good one. Pelican paste is another hardened carnauba-based wax, or just pure carnauba wax works as well. So if you've done all of that correctly, you can end up with some true masterpieces. But if you guys don't want to go through the whole process of making your own steel, we are planning on offering billets to the public here in the future. If you go onto the Stelter MFG website and subscribe to the email list, you will be among the first to know when that starts happening. So if you guys are interested in Damascus, if you find it as neat as I do, I'd very highly recommend checking out some of these makers, starting off with Salem Straub. He's the gentleman that taught me how to make Damascus. Very, very, very fortunate because he continues to push the envelope on what's possible, and he does, in my opinion, some of the best pattern welding in the world, and he's a neat fella. Some other gentlemen that I've learned an awful lot from are folks like Steve Schwarzer, who pioneered a lot of the mosaic patterns back in the day, and some of the other guys that I really appreciate. Friends of mine who are doing incredible pattern welding work are guys like Mareko Maamasi, Joshua Prince, Charlie Ellis, Gabe Fletcher, Jamie Lundell, Jason Morrissey, and there's all kinds of other dudes that are doing great work out there. A lot of the South American folks and guys more in the American bladesmith style of making do some really interesting stuff. Fellas like Rodrigo Sfredo, Dino Tom Franco, and then guys like Mike Quesenberry are just absolute masters of doing multi-bar and Turkish twist. Those guys are all doing incredible mosaic work, and some guys that are doing really interesting work with multi-bar steel. Guys like Julian Antunes, he does amazing mosaic as well. Henning Wilkinson, all of their Instagrams and a good place to follow along with them will all be linked in the description down below. So thank you guys so much for following along. Again, if you enjoy this content, please make sure you like and subscribe. Thank you to our patrons for patronizing us, and I will see you on the next one. Adios. Whoa. Cute hat, bro. Where'd you find that at?
StelterManufacturing.com.
That's neat. 4 colors, too.
Leather patch, 4 colors, every activity covered.
I'll definitely make sure to head on over to StelterManufacturing.com to get me one.
Or 4.
Or 4. Cool.